Welcome to the Registry Insider. I'm Bill Seifarth, CEO and Executive Director of the National Registry of EMTs. And on today's episode, we have the fortune of talking with three of our board of director members at the National Registry, all of whom are medical directors in different roles. I have Dr. Kevin Mackey, Dr. Sylvia Owusu-Ansah, as well as Dr. Maia Dorsett. Again, all three board members, all three medical directors with different roles. Before we dive into the topic of continued competency and in your respective roles as far as what you do in your organizations, can you give a little background in terms of what you do as a medical director, and that we have some context as it relates to continued competency? You want to start, Maia?
Sure. So I have a few different roles as a medical director. I am the medical director of an initial education program, a paramedic program at Monroe Community College. So I have that role in initial education. I'm an agency medical director for an agency I love called Gates Ambulance. And then on top of that, I'm the Monroe Livingston region. So our associate regional medical director for education and quality. And the predominant role I play there is leading quality improvement initiatives that are integrated across our entire region in upstate New York.
Cool. Sylvia.
So yes, I am the EMS medical director for UPMC Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. So I work more from an administrative standpoint, where I oversee any of the ambulances that come into our hospital that take care of children. In addition, I provide education, pediatric emergency medicine education for the region. I am also a liaison for Pittsburgh EMS, so I'm in charge of all of their training when it comes to pediatric emergency care. In addition, I am the EMS for Children's medical director for the state of Pennsylvania. So I am in charge of providing evidence-based pediatric protocols for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Cool. Thank you, Sylvia. Kevin.
My name's Kevin Mackey. I'm the medical director for Sacramento Fire Department and also the medical director for Sacramento Airport Fire Department.
Good. So as you can see, we have a wealth of medical director experience here joining us for this important conversation. And one of the strategic initiatives of the National Registry, starting with the launch of our new exam in July of 2024, is now going to be focused on continued competency. And certainly we've had other podcasts on this, how we can think differently about ensuring continued competency of EMS clinicians. But I'd love to hear from your respective role, from your perspectives and your respective roles, what you feel the role of the medical director is in ensuring continued competency, and what are some practical ways that medical directors can and should be doing that as part of the systems approach to ensuring continued competency. So whoever wants to lead off, Sylvia, if you want to.
Yeah, so I will say from the pediatric standpoint, it's really important to have continued competency because as many of us know, pediatric calls are only about 10% of the calls. And so EMS clinicians don't see pediatric patients very often. And so I think it's really important that EMS agencies integrate pediatric emergency care education into their education portfolio on a consistent basis. Our EMS agency does every 2 years, we do pediatric care, but emergency care education. But I'm really pushing for more consistency in that, whether it be small modules, simulation, mix of types of education, particularly when you're not seeing a population often enough and you need to keep up with the care that needs to be provided to that population.
So with low frequency, there's a critical element of education that has to be involved, especially for the low frequency and high criticality pediatric emergencies that tend to not be pleasant for EMS clinicians to handle. That's for sure. So,
that is true.
So education's key. How about you, Maia?
I think it's the fundamental. I'm going to start actually with the barrier, which is like bandwidth and time, which is I think the fundamental barrier we have for everything. When I think about what are the aspects of continued competency, I sort of put them into different baskets. One is, how do I help people maintain competency in these low frequency, high criticality procedures like sick children, bad airways, OB emergencies, right? Things that they may not even see. They'll learn about it in paramedic school and they may not see. And I can reflect on that, right? In my own clinical practice, I have a lot of anxiety about how do I maintain competency in these things that I need to do right the very first time, but I haven't seen in a while. So that's one bucket that we have to think about. How do we like track and maintain that for people so that they are comfortable when they're faced and that we are doing our due diligence to support them? Because I think that's our role as a medical director, is to support people and being able to take good care of patients and create a system where they're able to do that. The second, I think, is, right, things are constantly changing. I'm always faced with like, what do we do our training on? Because there's all these different things that we're changing. And sometimes I have to sort of like hold back change because I can't just like instate all these different things at the same time. I have to make sure that I'm like moving people forward as a cohort. And I think as the pace of research, right, rapidly changes, as our body of evidence is growing at an exponential rate, that also means that we have to be able to design a system where people can grow their practice at a rate that's going to make sure that they are actually meeting the standards of care as things move along. So I think like one recent example of this is I think it's safe to say that video laryngoscopy is quickly becoming a standard of care because we don't have a lot of pre-hospital evidence, but we have pretty good evidence with emergency and ICU physicians. We have pretty good evidence with anesthesiologists. So to think that somehow we're special in our own world is going to be unlikely. And there's good evidence, from like Jeff Jarvis, studies that he's done in EMS. So thinking, like for me, I was thinking like, how do I not only do sort of the logistics of rolling this out, but that's also a different skill set that I have to prepare people for, and a certain amount of attention I need to pay to that. So like there's those kinds of things. And then I think the last part of a role as a medical director is I have to be able to do all of those things, but then I also need to, from a quality management perspective, also take the vital signs of my system and say, how are we doing on all these other things? And I can tell you, we tend to focus a lot on sexy things in EMS, right? Like really sick patients. And what is video laryngoscopy? Like, I don't get too much pushback about wanting to do airway training. But from my role in quality improvement, I can tell you that the two care bundles that I've rolled out recently in our region, collaboratively with our physicians, is the geriatric fall care bundle and the dizziness and generalized weakness care bundle. And that is how do we care for this huge percentage of the patients we care for, which is actually where all our missed strokes and sepsis and all of that is. So I need to think about how do I make sure that people are competent to take care of all of those things when nobody thinks that actually takes anything special to be competent in, when actually it requires new skills on how do you assess for posterior circulation stroke, how do you properly assess for risks of refusals in a geriatric fall patient and weigh the risks and benefits. So I think that's where the challenge is that it's really exciting because there's all these new things and there's all these ways to, like, this amazing opportunity to continually get better at what we do. But how do I fit it all in? And that's why I think that medical directors need to work with training officers and quality improvement officers, the systems approach, to say, how do we accomplish all that? We need to redesign the system by which we accomplish that. Because quarterly training with your, sitting in a seat or coming in for skills at a certain thing, like, I can only accomplish so much by that model. And I'm never going to accomplish what I need to that fits those three buckets. So I think we have to share ideas about how do we accomplish things for those three buckets.
Well, that's a very comprehensive approach, but certainly a thorough.
Sorry, it was a long answer.
No, that's I didn't mean that. It was very comprehensive and it was very thorough, which I think adds to the. I think your words show how complex it is and the importance of the role that the medical director plays in this systems approach. They're not in it alone. Like you said, there's a lot of other roles. Kevin, what about from your perspective? Because you're obviously over two separate big departments, more urban. What do you see? And you're from the West Coast as well. So
I am the West Coaster. You're right.
Yeah.
We approach this from two distinct angles. One of them is that we do intentional training every year with every single paramedic on those skills that we've already talked about, the ones that are 2:00 in the morning when you're on. In our department, we work 48 96s. And so on day 2, you've run 32 calls, you've had 3 hours of sleep, and now you have a pediatric cardiac arrest in front of you where you don't have the opportunity to get a do-over. So we intentionally train and train and train and train on those skills that could easily go wrong. So examples are pediatric airway management, mixing and administration of a push dose pressor. Like, how do you do that? How do you establish the correct drip rate if you're doing drips for TXA? I know a lot of the country's gone away from dripping to slow IV pushing. We're almost there. We're about a month away. But all the way down to transcutaneous pacing. Like the key parts of a skill that you need to get right that you don't get a do-over. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is through a medical director's lens, I have the fortunate opportunity working with the EMS division to get optics on things that just didn't quite go right that, oh my gosh, I've seen that before and I've seen it again. And so a great example of that is needle thoracostomy. And so needle thoracostomy, again, is a skill that's not used that often, but using it correctly is essential. Using it incorrectly can actually cause harm. Iatrogenic pneumothorax would come right to mind, or getting it too low. And we saw a pattern of patients that were coming in. We're getting reports from hospitals, from our trauma centers that maybe we need to rebuff this skill. And so Maia talked about doing this on quarterly training. We have something we do called Medic Minute. And in Medic Minute, every single month, every single ambulance comes through the EMS division and we have a theme. It's no longer than 15 minutes. And it gets our EMS division logistics guys chances to actually touch the ambulances. Maybe there's something in there that we need to change or move around. We're also involved in 3 national studies right now, PD Part, PD Dose, and we're going to be kicking off CalRock. So like we're involved in these national studies. So we got to make sure that in the heat of the moment, we get it right. And so we intentionally train monthly with every single paramedic that's on an ambulance on those key things that we got to make sure it's like, I call it spinach. Like, it's sometimes when you're a kid, it just doesn't taste quite right, but it's good for you. Yeah. And then you get used to it. And then you start liking spinach because I'm sorry if you like spinach out there. I love spinach.
I like spinach. I like spinach salad.
So I call it the spinach of EMS. It's going to make you stronger. It's going to make you better and healthier.
It's going to make you more competent when you need to be. So a lot like Sylvia, you focus on the high criticality, but yet low frequency events. The 2:00 in the morning pediatric cardiac arrest is to use that, which I think that's a common theme I'm hearing from all three of you.
And I think, right, there's lots of different components. I think the challenge is how do you track that in a way that you're compliant with regulations and people are getting credit for it? Because I think
many states don't give credit to a lot of these activities. They're forbidden.
Exactly. We're lucky in the fact that we are a CE provider for the state of California. And so every single paramedic I touch, we have a logistics division that tracks every single training course. I sign their CE certificate.
So you're fortunate. Yeah, you're fortunate.
I don't think that we're common. I think many.
Yeah. And for me, like we do it too, right? Like we create it as a class, they get credit. It goes into their continuing education. Because I think that there's this perception, right? Like, I think we have to, I don't know if the right is like merge with the interest, just like we want like align payment models with what's good for patient. We need to align our continuing education and recertification models with what's good for patients and what's good for providers.
Guidelines.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yes.
Like just like we've aligned the exam, right? So there's the table of evidence to say that, it's not like, okay, what do I learn from what to do and what's different on the test? It's like, no, actually those things are the same. The test is based on evidence-based guidelines. I think the same has to be true for continuing education. It's not like, what do I do for my job versus what do I do to recertify? Actually, what do I need to do to recertify should be what do I need to do to maintain competence in my job? And I think the continued competency is like us imagining what does that look like? That's right, because that's the point of that process.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like. Obviously, but before we get in there, let's talk about the evidence-based guidelines. And we'll put the link in the comments section. But prehospitalguidelines.org is the Prehospital Guidelines Consortium that has 2022 and soon to be 2024 reading list, as well as a systematic review, which is a pretty thorough review. That's a good resource that EMS clinicians, certainly medical directors, educators, anyone can go to there and access that. Most of the articles there, the registry's paid for, they're free access. So it's a free resource that can be used and should be used. So as it relates to getting back to you were alluding to the systems approach, it's not just the medical director alone. It's also the training officer. It's also the other educators in the education system. It's the regulators. It's, associations. It is a truly comprehensive systems approach to this. With that complexity, what are some of the other challenges and as it relates to ensuring continued competency, and how can we do better at making sure that we're actually measuring continued competency in a meaningful way and in a real way, given all the complexities and regulations and other stuff you're alluding to?
I would say that there's not just like EMS, there's not a one size fits all.
Right.
And so I think we need to be open-minded about the types and the ways that we can do continued competency. Maybe not necessarily, you cannot pull your paramedics or EMTs out for an 8-hour lecture 3 times a week. Maybe it's what Dr. Mackey suggested is like a 15-minute kind of pop and stop means of getting education. Maybe it's a virtual reality or a little bit of simulation. Maybe it's an at-home interactive module. Maybe it's the EMS medical director showing up at the EMS agency and doing a quick real-time hands-on training. And so I think we need to begin to think, yes, innovatively.
And it's not just sitting in a seat in a classroom. What you rattled off is not that.
So I'm going to put my medical director and quality improvement hat on. I was invited here as a medical director, but I think an important role I play is in quality improvement. I think whenever you can look at your outcome measures, you look at your outcome measures. Mm-hmm. So, right, like if I want to say, are people taking, when I say competency, I care less, honestly, that you can answer a question on a test, or you perform well in a simulation, or you can bag a mannequin. I care, what does your care look like, and what do the outcomes for the patients in your system? We think about continued competency all the time in terms of like an individual provider. Mm-hmm. But really, I think about like continued competency on a system perspective, because we know that the ability of people to perform well has so much to do with like the system design that we've put around them, and the culture that's in place. So I think the first step to say is, do we have continued competency, is that you start thinking about, how do I measure clinical care around things that matter? And then there's the things that become very hard to measure. Like that's why, the high acuity, low frequency events, right? Like from a quality perspective, those give me, I get like, what do I do about that? Because it's hard to measure. Like if there's like a one-off or something goes poorly or not, like then I can focus on that one singular event, and I'm looking at, did I train people appropriately? Do we have the right equipment? What is like the system design that goes into it?
And that's a continuous cycle. It's not
that's a continuous cycle. Yeah. But like you need to start measuring, right? Like we have done tremendous things with EMS data. Electronic PCR vendors have been doing things about how do you build, like, are you looking at your NEM-SQA measure, right? Like national organizations have gotten together and said, these are things that are prioritized and matter to patients. Like you should say, how are we? And you can compare your performance with similar agencies across the region. Not to say like, oh, like we don't suck as bad as that guy, but like look what people can achieve. Like that is possible. What do I need to change about my system to achieve that? And continued competency is like one part of it. It's like one aspect of how to achieve good care for patients. And then I think the other part of it is, so that's how you measure whether or not you're doing it. Somehow you have to encourage lifelong learning. Mm-hmm.
And there has to be a personal responsibility of the clinician. It can't be you're mandated to go to training, or there's got to be some ethical responsibility.
But I think that is a huge component of initial education. That's why I say like my most important role as a medical director is my role in initial education. Because that's where I like develop.
And that's your passion.
That's my passion. But it's also like where I develop relationships with students. I think there's so much that we've done that it's like about getting the right answer. And then they get into medicine and you're like, what's the right answer? There's like not much black and white, and there's a whole lot of gray. And how do I navigate this? How do I get feedback on whether I made the right decision? What do I do when I've made the wrong decision? And how do I effectively learn from my failure and grasp that as an opportunity?
Ensuring continued competency.
Yeah. So that's the role, I think, in initial education. It's not just about getting like the facts in their brains and making sure they make the right decisions in scenarios. Like we have to inspire people to say, this is how I grow. I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm going to make failures. Like I'm going to have an approach to deal with that before I leave.
And I recognize I'm going to learn from those failures.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
I think there's a role of the medical director too to celebrate what right looks like.
Reinforce it.
So when we have trained on something together and a very difficult call comes down, we de-identify it, but celebrate it as a department and call out the team that was involved in it. And so in the firehouse, things happen naturally around dinner tables and on tailboards. Like where there's conversations, it's like, wow, did you see this? What went right? What went wrong? And then we talk about it as a group about what right looks like.
Yeah.
And that just builds competency as well throughout the system, because competency looks different based upon experience, years of work, education, background. So it's not the same across everything. Competency does look very, very different.
and we also celebrate learning from failure. So like we do regional case reviews, and some of them are, and I intentionally pick ones, right? When somebody did like amazing care and there's good pathophysiology and it's a great case to talk about, we pick those and we talk about those. But I think that a tremendous impact on our system is having EMS clinicians co-present with their medical director about a case where things went wrong. And we institute this principle of like, right, in case review, there's a principle of local rationality. Like if I had that information, would I have made the same decision? And I actually like insert, like people respond like, what decision would I make? And you realize like everybody has the ability to learn, because there you institute that if only one person learns from a failure, right? Like my role as a medical director or system has failed. Like I have to maximize when like bad things happen, that everybody, the maximum number of people learns from it.
That's good.
But it also demonstrates like if you can get people to share that, that's actually, to me, that's like a very high level competence in the affective domain, is the ability to effectively learn from your failure. And we think about competence all the time in terms of like psychomotor skills and knowledge and all of this. But I think like there's a lot of people who are falling off the competence train in the affective domain of how do you behave? How do you address failure? Do you think of your patients as human beings with all those things? And so it's quickly gets really complex. And I think there's going to be like no perfect answer, but there's things that you can do to address that.
I think you can address that on a system-based level. So what we do is we teach our pediatric emergency medicine fellows what it's like to be an EMS clinician, so they can be in their shoes. So to Maia's point, that effective, like this is your partner, this is another person, and the goal is to make sure that the patient has great outcomes. So approaching that as well from a systems-based approach, the nurses that you work with, the handoffs with EMS clinicians, the physicians, the techs, so that the patient in the end wins.
And it is, I think that's a good place to end our episode today, with the focus on the patient, because ultimately it's all about the patient. That's what we're there for, to ensure continued competency. That is the recipient of the care and the system of care going into it to ensure continued competency. So I'd like to thank all three of you for spending time out of the boardroom with me today to talk about this important aspect of the role of medical directors and how you collectively ensure continued competency. And it's definitely a systems approach. So thank you all for what you do at the registry as well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for joining us this episode. And as always, stay safe. Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you wouldn't mind, please click the like and subscribe buttons, as well as the notifications so you can get notifications of upcoming episodes. Also, for the latest and greatest happenings of the National Registry, feel free to go to nremt.org. Thank you very much. And again, stay safe.